Have you ever wondered why, in the 19th century, the age of steam and electricity, the most in-demand invention, suddenly became a coffin with an alarm? They try to convince us that it was just a Victorian curiosity, a strange fad, or a consequence of doctors' ignorance, unable to distinguish a coma from death. But that's a lie. Official history hides from us monstrous statistics that make your blood run cold. You have been deceived. Everything they told you in school about the development of medicine at that time is a screen concealing a global biological catastrophe. Why did engineers, capable of designing the most complex bridges and factories, rush en masse to patent devices for rescue from graves? The answer is right before our eyes, but we prefer not to notice it. Imagine this primal, clammy horror. You wake up in a tight wooden box. Air left for 15 minutes. Around you, 6 feet of damp earth. Your screams are heard only by worms. And now realize that this is not a horror movie plot, but everyday reality for thousands of people in the mid-19th century. The fear of being buried alive, known as taphophobia, gripped the planet not for nothing. It was not paranoia. It was a reaction to a mass phenomenon that historians shyly call diagnostic errors. But let's look at the numbers and facts soberly. In Germany alone, in the second half of the 19th century, more than 30 different designs of so-called safety coffins were patented. In the United States of America and Great Britain, the count went into the hundreds. Would pragmatic industrialists invest huge funds in producing complex mechanisms if the problem was isolated? Of course not. Demand creates supply, and this demand was colossal. Patents of that time amaze with their technical complexity. These were not just boxes with a hole. These were real engineering life support systems. Consider the patent of Dr. Johann Tabor. The coffin was equipped with a system of bells, led to the surface, a glass window for light access, and a tube for supplying fresh air. Another inventor, Franz Wester, proposed a design with a long tube through which the deceased could not only breathe, but also pull a cord, raising a flag over the grave. In 1868, a coffin with an electric alarm was patented. Think about it for a second. Electricity was just beginning to enter everyday use. It was expensive and complex, yet it was already being implemented in the funeral industry. Why spend cutting-edge technology on the dead if you were 100% sure they were dead? The answer is simple and terrifying. No one was sure. Moreover, society knew that death at that time had become a relative concept. Patent office archives were literally buried under blueprints of devices for rescuing the revived. A device with a ladder, a device with a spring-loaded lid ejector, a device with telephone connection to the cemetery watchman's house. This was an industry of panic. But what caused this panic? The official version states, cholera epidemics and poor medical standards. Supposedly, doctors in the chaos simply didn't have time to check pulses. But this explanation doesn't hold up to any scrutiny. 19th century doctors were excellent diagnosticians and anatomists. They knew the signs of rigor mortis perfectly well. What they encountered was not just a medical error. It was a mass falling of people into a state indistinguishable from death, but not death itself. Lethargic sleep? Anabiosis? Or perhaps the aftermath of some external influence we're forbidden to know about? If we analyze the chronology of these patents' appearance, we'll see a clear correlation with other strange events of that period. It was precisely at this time, in the mid-19th century, that so-called mortuaries, or waiting houses, began to be built around the world. The most famous example is the Munich Leichenhaus. These were gigantic halls where the bodies of the deceased were not buried immediately, but left under observation for several days. Strings were tied to the fingers of the deceased, connected to bells in the watchman's room, and these bells rang. They rang so often that the watchman went mad. This was not isolated cases of resurrection. This was a systemic failure in human biology of that era. Official science tells us these were cases of coma. But let's ask an uncomfortable question. Why exactly in this historical period did the human body suddenly start shutting down en masse? Why did the number of people falling into anabiosis number in the thousands? If we discard the theory of collective madness and look at the situation like engineers, we'll see that the human body was reacting to changes in environmental conditions. A sharp change in atmospheric pressure, a shift in air composition, poisoning by an unknown gas. What if safety coffins were not protection against medical errors, but an attempt to save those who fell under the influence of a global atmospheric cataclysm? We know that with a sharp decrease in oxygen content or a change in the magnetic field, living organisms can fall into a state of deep inhibition of all vital processes. Their hearts beat once a minute. Breathing becomes undetectable by a mirror. To an external observer, they are dead. But they are alive. And they woke up already underground. Traces of this horror we find during the exhumation of old cemeteries. Skeletons turned over in coffins, scratches on the inside of the lids, into which century-old debris has eaten. Finger phalanges, battered, bloody. These are silent witnesses of what we call the 19th century. But the most terrifying discovery awaits us ahead. If we compare the number of issued patents for safety coffins with the birth and death rate charts of that period, a picture emerges that completely overturns the official history of demographics. We stand on the threshold of exposing a secret that explains where millions of people disappeared to and where the new ones came from. Get ready. Further on, we will peer into the abyss that was hidden from us behind the dry lines of textbooks. Let us delve into the details that official historiography prefers to bypass, calling them curiosities of the past. If you think that the fear of being buried alive was the lot only of suspicious rich people and impressionable poets, you are deeply mistaken. It was a systemic problem requiring government decisions and huge financial investments. In the mid-19th century in Europe, especially in the German lands, the creation of special institutions, waiting mortuaries, was legally enshrined. But these were not the cold rooms with tiled floors that we see in modern detective stories. These were real sanatoriums for the dead. Waiting halls in Munich, Frankfurt, and Mainz were high-tech complexes with heating systems, ventilation, and round-the-clock medical staff duty. Why heat a room with corpses? Any pathologist will tell you that heat accelerates decomposition. But the architects of these structures pursued a different goal. They created ideal conditions for awakening. The official version states that heating was needed for the watchman's comfort, but documents from those years say the opposite. The instructions clearly state, maintain a temperature conducive to the restoration of vital functions. This means only one thing. The authorities knew that the death of their citizens was not final. They were waiting for the effect of the unknown influence on us to wear off. Look at the design of these halls. Bodies were laid out in rows, and cords were tied to the arms and legs of each deceased, connected to a gigantic organ of bells in the watchman's room. This was not just an alarm. It was a highly complex engineering network. And this network worked. Archives preserve reports of how, in the middle of the night in such halls, a real symphony of horror began. Dozens of bells ringing simultaneously. Not one, not two, but dozens. Skeptics will say that it was gases escaping from the bodies that set the mechanisms in motion. But 19th century engineers were not idiots. The mechanisms of safety coffins and alert systems were designed taking into account so-called false alarms. Spring-loaded blockers were used that reacted only to sharp, convulsive movement characteristic of an awakening person, not to the smooth settling of tissues. And if the bells rang, it means people were moving. They were trying to get up. Here we approach the main contradiction. We are told that medicine was primitive, but allow me, it was precisely in the 19th century that physiology boomed. René Laennec's stethoscope had already been invented. Doctors were excellent at auscultating heartbeats. Experiments with electricity and galvanism were actively conducted. Do you really believe that thousands of certified doctors around the world suddenly forgot how to distinguish a living person from a dead one? That's absurd. They didn't forget. Old diagnostic methods simply stopped working. People were in a state that the science of that time could not classify as life, but it was not death either. The heart stopped or beat at a rate of 1 beat every few minutes. Body temperature dropped to the ambient temperature. Tissues became hard as stone. This is the classic picture of deep anabiosis, typical of some animal species, but not humans. What could cause such a mass biological reaction? The only logical explanation is a sharp change in the external living conditions. Let's recall physics. If atmospheric pressure drops sharply, or the air's gas composition changes, the human body experiences shock. Oxygen starvation, or hypoxia, can lead to deep coma, with metabolism slowing hundreds of times. There is a theory that in the 19th century, an event occurred that led to a temporary loss of the atmosphere, or its poisoning. Possibly, these were emissions from the Earth's depths, the very ones that caused the first floors of buildings worldwide to be buried under clay and silt. Gases bursting to the surface could act as a powerful nerve paralytic toxin or natural anesthesia. People simply shut down. They fell where they stood and fell into hibernation. Those who survived and remained conscious buried their neighbors in panic, mistaking their condition for instant death from plague. Then, after days or weeks, the gas's effect weakened, and the dead began to wake up. This explains the primal fear that permeates the literature and press of the 19th century. This was not a fashion for Gothic. This was a documentary chronicle of the post-apocalypse. Ponder the patent of Count Michel de Carniche-Carnicki. His invention, presented at the end of the century, was a hermetic coffin with a tube leading to the surface. At the slightest movement of the deceased's chest, a valve opened, providing air access, and a bright signal ball rose to the surface. This coffin was demonstrated at exhibitions as a technological marvel. It was bought for fabulous sums. Why spend a fortune on a coffin if, according to official science statistics, the probability of being buried alive is 0.001%? Because the real statistics were different. Every second person could end up trapped. We should also pay attention to the condition of the bodies found when opening old crypts. Many of them are naturally mummified, without embalming. The tissues did not rot, but dried out. This is direct proof that the bacterial environment of that time was different. Decomposition processes were stopped or slowed. This once again confirms the version of a global change in the atmosphere and air's chemical composition. The world of the 19th century was sterile, like an operating room after quartz lamp treatment. And in this sterile world, millions of people slept in lethargic sleep in their graves, futilely pulling on bell cords that no one heard because the cemetery watchmen were also asleep or already dead. We see only the tip of the iceberg, only those patents that have reached us. But how many devices were made artisanally? How many people were saved? And, most importantly, what did they say after waking up? Archives are silent about this, but traces of this information we will find if we look at the oddities in demographic data and the appearance of new people without a past. If we stop perceiving history as a set of scattered dates and look at it as a mathematical model, we will see glaring inconsistencies that cannot be explained from the standpoint of official demography. We are assured that the 19th century was a time of endless wars, revolutions, unsanitary conditions, and monstrous epidemics of cholera, typhus, and smallpox. Mortality should have been off the charts. However, statistics show us an incredible, explosive population growth precisely during this period. Where did these millions of people come from? How, in conditions where, according to historians, people died from a scratch, did cities expand at such a speed that they required millions of tons of brick and glass? Here, we find a direct connection with the epidemic of the buried alive. Imagine a scenario that explains both of these phenomena. The global impact we talked about earlier, be it an atmospheric shift or a chemical attack of unknown nature, plunged a significant part of the population into a state of deep anabiosis. For an external observer without brain scanning technologies, these people were dead. They were buried. By the thousands. By the tens of thousands. But the decomposition process did not occur. And here is where the most interesting part begins. Those who were not buried in the ground, but remained in houses or those very waiting halls, began to come back to life en masse. But as whom did they wake up? Medicine knows cases where, after prolonged coma or clinical death, a person loses memory. Their personality is erased. Now scale this up to entire cities. Crowds of physically healthy people, but with blank consciousness. Like formatted hard drives. They needed to be given a new history, new names, new goals. Perhaps this explains the appearance of a huge number of orphanages and educational homes in the second half of the 19th century. These were not only children. These were people without memory. They needed to be retrained, given language, a profession, and loyalty to the new system of government. Let's return to the coffins. Why were the patents for them so complex? Why were copper, complex lever systems, air ducts with filtration used? If you're simply afraid of waking up in a box, a hammer is enough to break the lid if the layer of earth is not thick, or a simple tube. But the designs of Vesta, Tabor, and Carnicki resemble survival capsules in a hostile environment. What if these devices were not intended for cemeteries as we understand them, but for preserving life during that very cataclysm? The coffin's hermetic seal protected not from worms, but from the external environment, from the gas or radiation that was killing or putting to sleep all living things on the surface. Bells and signal flags were a primitive but reliable communication system. Imagine a city being overwhelmed by a wave of dense soil or a mud flow, the very one that buried the first floors of buildings worldwide. People hide in prepared capsules. They know they will be buried, and the only hope for rescue is an air tube and a signaling mechanism that will indicate to rescuers, if any remain, where to dig. The panic over being buried alive is distorted memory of real preparation for a global catastrophe. People remembered that their ancestors survived in boxes underground, but forgot the context, and this fear transformed into a phobia of lethargic sleep. Look at the architecture of old cemeteries. 19th century crypts are often dug deep into the ground, with sturdy vaults, ventilation, and iron doors. These are not graves. These are bunkers. Individual bunkers for weathering the acute phase of the cataclysm. And those very safety coffins were the inner lining of these bunkers. A last chance life support system. When we read newspaper notes from that time about miraculous rescues from graves, we are reading reports of catastrophe survivors. But there is yet another layer of lies: the Industrial Revolution. We are told that steam engines drove it. But who stood at the machines? Where did the army of skilled workers come from, ready to work 16 hours for pennies? These were the very awakened. People brought out of anabiosis, deprived of memory of the previous world, of their rights, of their real families. Ideal biorobots for building a new, brave world. The fear of being buried alive was artificially stoked to make people buy these expensive devices, which, by irony of fate, were tools of selection. The rich could afford a safety coffin, a chance at survival and awakening. The poor were simply dumped into mass graves where there were no chances. Analyze the amount of metal that went into producing these coffins. Thousands of tons of copper and brass. These were strategic resources. No state would allow them to be spent on the whims of the dead if it weren't a matter of national security or preserving the elite. These systems were patented with government approval, so the government knew what was coming, or knew it was already happening. They were preparing for the mass shutdown of the population. And the safety coffin was nothing other than a ticket to the future, a hibernation capsule disguised as a ritual item. We look at the blueprints and see funny bells, but we should see the desperate attempt of past engineers to preserve the spark of life in a dying world. And, judging by the fact that you and I are here, they succeeded. But the price was terrible. History was rewritten by those who woke up first and picked up the shovel. Now, as the veil begins to lift from your eyes, it's time to realize the full scale of the betrayal committed against humanity. We are approaching the darkest chapter of this history. The chapter that evokes not just fear, but deep, cold rage. If safety coffins were survival capsules, and waiting halls were rehabilitation centers after a global cataclysm, then a logical question arises. Why did this technology disappear as suddenly as it appeared? Why, at the beginning of the 20th century, did patents abruptly cease, and the topic of being buried alive become a taboo over which people only nervously chuckle? The answer is horrific in its cynicism. The project was shut down. Those who controlled the reboot process decided that there was no one left to save. Or, even more terrifying, that there was no need to save anymore. Imagine the situation. You are in a hermetic capsule underground. You survived the impact. You woke up. You pull the cord that moves the bell on the surface. You hear this ringing through the air duct tube. You ring for an hour, 2, a day. But no one comes. Not because there's no one up there, but because up there, the decision has already been made. Old humanity must remain in the ground. Those who managed to wake up in the first wave became the workforce. Those who lingered in anabiosis were written off as spent material. 19th century cemeteries are not places of rest. They are mothballed warehouses of biomaterial that was never utilized. This is where the explanation lies for yet another phenomenon of that time: the explosive growth of psychiatric hospitals. Huge brick complexes, resembling palaces and fortresses at the same time, were built worldwide at an incredible speed. We are told that people suddenly began to go mad en masse. But think logically. If a person wakes up after lethargy caused by toxic exposure and remembers a different world, a world without smoking chimneys, a world with different architecture, a world of free energy, what will the new authorities do with him? They will declare him insane. The epidemic of hysteria and madness in the 19th century was not a disease. It was a conflict of memory. Survivors, whose consciousness was not completely erased, tried to tell the truth. They spoke of how the sky was different, how the sun shone brighter, how cities were not covered in soot. They were immediately isolated. Psychiatry of that time, with its lobotomies, ice baths, and electroshock, was a punitive tool for erasing memory. Doctors were paid not for treatment, but for the final suppression of will. Those very safety coffins with bells became, for many, not salvation, but the first stage of sorting. If you woke up and remember nothing, welcome to the factory. If you woke up and start asking questions, welcome to the house of sorrow, or back to the pit. Let us return to bell technology. Why sound specifically? Why not just a flag or light signal? Patents often mention that the bell must have a specific tone. We know that sound is a wave. Low-frequency and high-frequency vibrations can affect the brain and cellular structures. What if the bell system worked both ways? It was not only a distress signal, but also a tool for awakening. Resonance. Perhaps cemetery watchmen did not just listen. They were supposed to send specific sound signals through the tubes to stimulate people out of their comatose state. Sound therapy, whose technologies today are considered lost or esoteric, was a purely technical task in the 19th century. But someone turned off the sound. In one moment, the bells were removed. Tubes were filled in. Patents were shoved into distant archives. This coincides with the period of final establishment of that historical picture of the world we know today. The industrial era triumphed. It needed obedient cogs, not people remembering the greatness of the past. Millions of those who lay in safety coffins, awaiting the signal to awaken, remained there. Their silent screams, their scratches on coffin lids, their overturned bodies. This is evidence of the greatest genocide, disguised as natural mortality. Do you feel this chill? This is not mysticism. This is the cold calculation of the new world masters. They used the fear of being buried alive to make the elites of the old world voluntarily climb into traps, promising them safety and awakening. They sold tickets to the future that turned out to be tickets to nowhere. And for the common people, they invented a fairy tale about cholera to explain why neighbors dropped dead on the streets and why they needed to be buried quickly, without extra questions, sprinkled with lime. Lime, by the way, perfectly destroys organics, hiding traces that the corpses might still have been alive. We are descendants of those who either did not fall under the influence of the sleeping gas or woke up with a clean memory, ready to believe any lie written in the morning newspaper. We were taught to fear death, but not taught to fear the lie that substitutes for our life. We look at old engravings depicting houses of the dead and think how strange our ancestors were. But they were not strange. They were desperate. They fought for life until the last heartbeat in a wooden box, while upstairs they were already dividing their property and redrawing maps of continents. Realizing this fact should evoke in you not just sadness, but a desire to investigate. If such a reboot happened just 150 years ago, what prevents them from repeating it again? After all, control technologies have become more perfect, and our memory even shorter. So, a complete picture opens before us, grandiose and horrifying in its completeness. The puzzle we assembled piece by piece, from strange patents for coffins with bells to first floors of buildings buried in clay worldwide, has finally come together. The epidemic of fear of being buried alive in the 19th century was not mass psychosis. It was collective unconscious knowledge of what was really happening. It was the agony of a civilization being erased from the face of the earth. Safety coffins were the last, desperate, and essentially futile attempt to preserve life amid global territory cleansing. Those who patented these devices understood something was coming from which one could not hide simply behind closed shutters. Look at our cities: St. Petersburg, Paris, Rome, Chicago. Everywhere we see the same thing: buildings sunk several feet into the ground. Historians mumble about the cultural layer, about how people didn't sweep streets for centuries. But you and I understand the absurdity of these claims. This soil, this clay and silt burying the first floors, is the very blanket under which the sleepers were covered. Those who managed to hide in their high-tech coffin capsules ended up buried under feet of dense rock. No bells, no flags could break through this layer. Air duct tubes clogged instantly. Millions of people, who expected to weather the catastrophe in comfortable anabiosis, were walled up forever. That's why the fashion for safety coffins disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. The surviving elites, those who weathered the cataclysm in real, deep bunkers, which we today may call the subway or catacombs, realized individual capsules don't work against geophysical weapons of such scale. The project was deemed unsuccessful. The technology was discontinued, patents hidden, and memory of it turned into tall tales for tickling nerves. The era of the Great Reboot began. We live in a post-apocalyptic world. Everything we call achievements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries is not inventions, but rediscovery or deconservation of old technologies. Electricity, radio, wireless communication, all this existed before the catastrophe, but at a much higher level. The New World masters simply doled out these technologies to us in portions, as the new population of people, orphans, raised in incubators and orphanages, became ready to service them. We were convinced that we evolved from apes gradually, so we wouldn't ask questions about who built these majestic cathedrals with their impossible geometry and acoustics, which are actually technical devices of the old world. The fear of being buried alive is our genetic memory. It is the echo of that horror when our ancestors realized the sky was falling to earth and the air was turning into poison. We are all descendants of those who survived by chance, or those artificially bred to populate empty ghost cities. And today, when we see the world elite again building giant underground cities, buying up islands and stockpiling seeds, we must ask ourselves, is a new cycle being prepared? Is that why they are herding us into digital control frameworks and medical experiments again? That another sleep phase is approaching? History is cyclical. Look around, analyze the facts. Don't believe words, believe only logic and numbers. All facts say that the global reboot happened, and its traces are everywhere. The question is only whether we can prevent the next one, or we will again become clay for the foundation of future civilizations. The bell is ringing. Do you hear it? Or are you already asleep?